I was teasing my husband in front of my girlfriends, enjoying the easy laughter of the moment, when the unthinkable happened. He walked up to me, his face a mixture of pain and resolve, and calmly said that he was done. The weight of his words didn't fully register at first, but as he turned and walked away, shoulders tense and deliberate, the reality of what was happening hit me hard. My heart felt as though it had shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound of its breaking somehow louder than the fading hum of the barbecue around me. Noah and I had been married for just over a year, and in that instant, I realized I might have destroyed everything. My name is Sarah, I'm 23 years old, and this is the story of how I let everything I loved slip through my fingers. It had all started innocently enough on a warm Saturday afternoon in Willowbrook, a picturesque little town tucked into the hills of upstate New York. Our neighbor, Mrs. Simpson, was hosting her annual summer kickoff party, an event that had become a cherished tradition in our small community. Everyone was there, enjoying the smell of fresh grilled food and the sound of cheerful conversations mingling with the buzz of cicadas. I had been standing in a loose circle of women, a glass of chilled rose in my hand, laughing at some half-forgotten joke. Meanwhile, Noah was by the grill, effortlessly charming the other men as he flipped burgers with the same quiet diligence he brought to everything he did. At one point, he glanced over and caught my eye, offering me that warm, familiar smile that had first won my heart years ago. I should have smiled back. I should have stepped away from the group to tell him how much I appreciated him, maybe even given him a quick kiss to show him I cared. But instead, I turned away, my attention fixed on entertaining my friends. I launched into a story, sharing an anecdote that painted Noah in a light-hearted but unflattering way. I told them about how I'd casually mentioned craving sushi from an upscale spot in the city, the kind of place that's nearly impossible to book, and how Noah had surprised me the very next day with a reservation. I explained that he'd pulled some strings through a client to make it happen, which earned a chorus of admiring sighs from the women around me. But I wasn't done. I went on to describe how, once we'd arrived at the restaurant, I had changed my mind and decided I wanted Italian instead. Noah, ever the accommodating husband, had simply smiled, cancelled the reservation, and taken me to a nearby trattoria without a word of complaint. I laughed as I recounted how willing he always was to bend over backwards for me, even joking that sometimes I wondered if he had a backbone at all. The laughter from my friends was cut short by an uncomfortable silence. Confused, I turned and saw Noah standing nearby, holding a plate of freshly grilled burgers. His face was unreadable, but the slight tremble in his hands betrayed just how deeply my words had hurt him. What followed was devastating. Noah calmly but firmly led me away from the group, the tension in his shoulders a clear indication of how much this moment weighed on him. As we moved toward the far edge of the yard, shielded from view by Mrs. Simpson's prized rose bushes, my cheeks burned with humiliation. I was certain everyone at the party was watching, and even then, a part of me believed this would blow over. Noah had always forgiven me before, and I convinced myself this time wouldn't be any different. But it was different. Once we were alone, Noah set the plate of burgers down and told me, in no uncertain terms, that he was done. He was done with feeling like the butt of every joke. Done with being made to feel small or unworthy of respect. Done with being taken for granted by someone who claimed to love him. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always assumed Noah's love for me was unshakable, that no matter how far I pushed, he would always be there, ready to forgive and move forward. But standing there, looking into his eyes, I realized just how deeply I had wounded him. He hadn't been angry, anger would have been easier to face. Instead, his voice had carried the weight of exhaustion and heartbreak, a quiet resignation that was far worse than any raised voice or shouted accusation. The truth was undeniable. I had humiliated him, not just once, but time and again, and I had done it so casually, so thoughtlessly, that I hadn't even noticed. For years, I had taken Noah's kindness for granted, mistaking his quiet strength for weakness, and now I was paying the price. His frustration was palpable as he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew all too well. It was his way of keeping control when emotions threatened to boil over. He'd put up with so much, he said, convincing himself that if he just loved me enough or tried hard enough, I would finally see him for who he truly was. But in his eyes, it was clear that he had realized I never really had. When I reached out to touch his arm, hoping to bridge the gap forming between us, he instinctively pulled away. That small act hit me harder than I expected, a physical ache spreading through my chest. I tried to plead, to assure him that I did see him, that I loved him, and that this could all be fixed if we just talked it out. But his expression told me there was no convincing him. His smile was bitter, filled with a sadness that carried more weight than anger ever could. He informed me it was over. He was leaving. By the time I returned home, he said, my belongings would be packed and waiting for me on the porch. The firmness in his tone left no room for argument, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't like the usual arguments we'd had, the kind I could smooth over with a smile or a promise. This was something different, something final. I tried to push back against his decision, panic rising in my voice. I reminded him of everything we had, our home, our life, and how it couldn't all be tossed aside over one stupid mistake. But he didn't see it that way. It wasn't just one comment, he said. It was years of them. Years of feeling undervalued, of giving endlessly to a relationship where all I did was take. The raw pain in his eyes stopped me short. It was a look I hadn't seen before, one that made it impossible to deny the truth. He loved me, that much was clear. But he was also at his limit. He had been for a while, and I had been too blind to notice. And now, there was no undoing what I had done. He walked away then, leaving me standing in the garden, surrounded by Mrs. Simpson's carefully tended hydrangeas. The party sounds around me felt distant, out of place against the storm of emotions building inside me. I watched him as he moved through the crowd, stopping only briefly to say goodbye to the hosts before disappearing into the distance. Something in me snapped. I couldn't let it end like this. Ignoring the whispers and sideways glances of the neighbors, I hurried after him, my heart pounding as I reached our house. It was a place we'd poured so much love and effort into, a charming two-story colonial, bought just a year ago. I burst through the door, desperate to fix things, to stop him from walking out of my life. But the sight in the living room froze me in my tracks. Noah was already packing my belongings, carefully folding my clothes, and placing them into suitcases with the same quiet determination that had once made me admire him. I begged him to stop, to talk to me, to let me explain, but he was resolute. This wasn't a conversation, and there would be no compromise. He reminded me of how I had insisted the house be in his name alone, a decision I'd made at the time to keep my options open. Now, it was coming back to haunt me. This was his home, not ours, and I had no claim to it. As I watched him pack, the weight of my actions became almost unbearable. Each item he folded seemed to symbolize a piece of the life we'd built together, now being dismantled before my eyes. My pleas for another chance fell on deaf ears. He had given me more chances than I deserved, and his patience had run out. When the last of my things had been packed, he carried the suitcases to the porch, his movements mechanical but purposeful. The setting sun cast long shadows across the front steps as I stood there, feeling small and lost. When I finally found the courage to ask what I was supposed to do next, he simply told me to call someone, my parents, my friends, but that I couldn't stay there. His exhaustion was evident in the lines on his face, deeper than I remembered. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, a mixture of love, regret, and finality. This was really the end. As he closed the door behind me, the sound of the lock turning was like the last nail in the coffin of our marriage. I sank onto the porch steps, surrounded by hastily packed suitcases that represented the fragments of my life, and finally let the tears flow freely. The reality of my actions, years of taking him for granted, bore down on me with crushing clarity. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and called my father. When he answered, I could barely get the words out through the sobs. I had nowhere else to go and no one to blame but myself. The next few days blurred into one long stretch of regret and sorrow. My parents took me in without hesitation, but the disappointment in their eyes was impossible to miss. They had adored Noah, treated him like the son they never had, and now they struggled to understand how I could have been so careless with someone they considered family. I spent most of my time in my childhood bedroom, drowning in my own thoughts. Tears soaked into my pillow as I replayed every mistake I'd made, every moment I had overlooked his love and taken his kindness for granted. At times, I stared blankly at the walls, trying to imagine what my life would look like now without him in it. The bright yellow walls of my childhood bedroom, once a cheerful backdrop to my teenage dreams, now felt like a mocking reminder of how far I had fallen. The faded posters of boy bands and celebrities seemed to laugh at me, as if to say life had been so much simpler when my biggest worry was what to wear to prom. My phone buzzed incessantly, a stream of messages pouring in from friends who had heard about what happened at the barbecue. Most of them carried a thin veneer of concern, but the curiosity beneath was unmistakable. They were fishing for details, eager to dissect my disaster for their own entertainment. A few, like Christy, my so-called best friend, tried to offer words of comfort, but even her messages felt superficial, filled with empty platitudes and promises I knew she wouldn't keep. As the days passed and the shock of my situation settled into a dull ache, I began to see the truth about these friendships. They were shallow, built on a foundation of gossip and convenience rather than genuine care or connection. No one truly cared about me or my pain. They were just grateful for the fresh drama to liven up their morning coffee routines. During one of my rare ventures out of my room, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the words carried clearly in the stillness of the house. My mother's sadness was unmistakable as she lamented how thoughtless I had been. She couldn't understand how I could treat someone as good as Noah so poorly, and my father, though quieter, didn't disagree. He remarked on how I'd always craved attention, how I had a tendency to act without considering the impact of my actions on others. Their words hit me like a slap. For the first time I began to see myself as others saw me. The image was harsh, unflattering, and painfully accurate. That night, restless and unable to sleep, I finally forced myself to confront the truth. I opened my laptop and started typing a list, titled Ways I Hurt Noah. With each line, I catalogued the moments I had dismissed his feelings, belittled his efforts, and put my desires above his needs. The list grew longer and longer, each entry a fresh wound to my already battered sense of self. By the time dawn's first light filtered through the curtains, I had filled pages. Reading back through it was devastating. I barely recognized the person I had become. How could I have been so careless, so selfish, with someone who had given me so much? For a fleeting moment, I considered calling Noah. My hand shook as I hovered over his contact, my heart desperate for the chance to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But as I sat there, I realized that my impulse was selfish. Reaching out to him wasn't about making amends, it was about easing my own guilt. What I wanted didn't matter anymore. What Noah needed was space, and for once, I decided to give it to him. Instead, I opened a new document and typed a different title, How to Become a Better Person. This time, the work wasn't about Noah or salvaging what I had lost. It was about becoming someone better, not for anyone else, but for myself. I never wanted to be the kind of person who hurt someone they loved again. The days stretched into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Life, indifferent to my personal turmoil, carried on. I stayed with my parents, trying to rebuild myself one small step at a time. The divorce proceedings were mercifully straightforward. Noah, in his characteristic kindness, didn't fight me on anything. He even agreed to a small alimony payment, despite the fact that I had contributed little to our marriage. His grace only deepened my regret, a constant reminder of what I had thrown away. I found a job at a local marketing firm, starting in an entry-level position. The work was far from glamorous, mostly data entry and running errands, but it was a beginning. For the first time I was supporting myself, learning what it meant to work hard and earn my own way. My social life, once the centerpiece of my existence, dwindled to almost nothing. Most of my so-called friends fell away when they realized I was no longer a source of entertainment or gossip. Even Christy eventually stopped calling, unable to reconcile herself with the person I was becoming. I didn't mourn the loss. The old parties and shallow conversations that once consumed my days felt meaningless now. The silence that had once terrified me became my sanctuary. In the stillness of my childhood bedroom, I began confronting the person I had been and the damage I had caused. The hours stretched long, filled with reading self-help books, pouring my thoughts into a journal, and, for the first time in my life, seeing a therapist. Dr. Swanson, my therapist, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle firmness that made it impossible to evade the truth. Week by week, she helped me untangle years of selfish behavior and distorted priorities. One session, she posed a question that left me reeling. Why had I felt the need to belittle Noah in front of my friends? I shrugged at first, avoiding her gaze as I toyed with a loose thread on the arm of the chair. Finally, I admitted it, because it made me feel good. I thought it made me seem impressive, like I had this incredible guy who would do anything for me. It boosted my ego to act as though I was so amazing that he'd put up with anything. Her silence pressed on me until I couldn't ignore it. When she finally asked how I thought that made Noah feel, the weight of the question crushed me. For the first time, I truly imagined what it must have been like for him, to love someone so deeply, only to have that love dismissed and mocked. I saw the humiliation he must have felt, the erosion of his self-worth. It was devastating. Dr. Swanson's words that day stayed with me long after the session ended. She told me that love isn't about control, performance, or appearances, it's about respect, kindness, and mutual support. I realized how I had failed, not just Noah, but so many others in my life. My relationships had always been skewed, with me taking far more than I ever gave. Months passed, and my efforts to rebuild myself continued. I saw the world, and my place in it, through a different lens. Every interaction became an opportunity to practice humility and compassion. I worked to mend my relationships with my parents, especially after hearing their disappointment in me that day in the kitchen. Slowly, I learned to prioritize others, not because it made me look good, but because it was the right thing to do. One afternoon, about 6 months after the barbecue, I ran into Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store. I had been avoiding most of my old neighbors out of shame, but Mrs. Patterson's warm smile made escape impossible. She called out to me, her cart already turning in my direction. Her face softened with genuine concern as she asked how I was doing. I forced a smile and offered a polite response, bracing myself for judgment or pity. Instead, she reached out and patted my arm with surprising kindness. Mrs. Patterson's compassion unraveled me. I confessed that I had made a mess of everything and didn't know how to fix it. She guided me to a quiet corner of the store, her voice gentle, but firm as she reminded me that everyone makes mistakes. The important thing, she said, is to learn from them and move forward. Her words lifted some of the weight I had been carrying. When she cautiously asked if I had spoken to Noah, I shook my head, explaining that I was giving him space. I couldn't imagine he'd want to hear from me after everything. Her response caught me off guard. She told me Noah had been asking about me, wondering how I was doing. The thought that he still cared, even after all I had put him through, was a bittersweet reminder of the man I had lost. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a small notepad from her purse and jotted down something quickly. She handed me the slip of paper with Noah's new phone number. He had changed it, she explained, but she thought he might appreciate hearing from me. I held the paper tightly, my heart racing with a mix of hope and fear. I wasn't sure if I could reach out to him. What would I even say? Could I risk reopening the wound I had caused, even if it was just to apologize? That night, I sat on my bed with the paper in one hand and my phone in the other. The number stared back at me, daring me to dial it. My chest tightened at the thought of hearing his voice again, knowing I might not deserve the kindness he had always shown me. I wanted to call, to apologize and explain, but the voice in my head whispered doubts. Was this for him, or was it just another way to ease my guilt? For what felt like hours, I sat in silence, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. The paper lay crumpled in my hand, its presence both comforting and accusing. The phone stayed silent beside me, the stillness of the room filled with the echoes of all the things I wished I could say. My fingers hovered over the keypad as I stared at Noah's number. Every word I thought of felt inadequate, a poor attempt to express the depth of my regret for all the pain I had caused. Finally, I settled on a text. It wasn't ideal, but I feared hearing his voice might weaken my resolve. I carefully typed out a message, pouring as much honesty as I could into it. I wanted him to know that I was sorry, not just for the incident at the barbecue, but for the years of selfishness and disregard. I acknowledged how much I had taken him for granted, and how deeply I regretted making him feel less than the extraordinary person he was. Wishing him happiness, even if it meant a life without me, I hit send and immediately tossed my phone aside, overcome with anxiety. The hours that followed felt endless. I paced my room, my chest tightening with every passing moment of silence. When no response came by nightfall, I began to accept the possibility that Noah had moved on. It was painful, but wasn't that what I wanted for him? For him to find the peace and happiness he deserved, even if it no longer included me. Just as I was settling into that difficult truth, my phone buzzed. A response had come. Noah's message was brief but kind, acknowledging my apology and wishing me well. Though the words were measured and distant, they carried a weight that lifted a small piece of the burden I had been carrying for so long. That night, for the first time in months, a glimmer of hope began to take root within me. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in rebuilding my life. My days became a mix of work, therapy sessions, and quiet evenings spent in reflection. I found solace in volunteering at a local animal shelter, where the simple act of caring for creatures who asked for nothing but love brought a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Yoga and meditation became regular practices, teaching me to quiet the chaos of my mind and appreciate moments of stillness. Occasionally, Noah and I exchanged polite messages, though the distance between us remained clear. It was evident that while the anger had faded, the trust one had broken would take far longer to mend, if it ever could. I didn't push for more, knowing that rebuilding myself was the only way forward. During this time, I reconnected with Emily, a neighbor I had previously dismissed because of the toxic influence of my former friends. Free from their shadow, I discovered that Emily's company was genuine and refreshing. Over coffee one afternoon, she filled me in on neighborhood gossip, though I listened with detachment, realizing how much my priorities had shifted. It was during this conversation that she revealed how some of my former friends, including Christy, had been vying for Noah's attention. The same women who once laughed alongside me at his expense were now pursuing him openly. The news left me reeling, a mix of emotions swirling, anger at their disloyalty, jealousy at the thought of someone else with Noah, and profound sadness for the relationships I had destroyed. Emily reassured me that Noah hadn't shown interest in any of them. Instead, he had focused on his own growth, dedicating himself to his work and his fitness. It didn't surprise me, it was so like him to channel hardship into self-improvement. Hearing this, I felt both admiration and a bittersweet ache, knowing how much better he deserved than the person I had been. Emily also remarked on how much I had changed since those days. Her words were a small comfort, a reminder that my efforts to grow were not in vain. For the first time in a long while, I felt the beginnings of a genuine friendship forming, one built on mutual respect and sincerity rather than convenience or gossip. As I looked up, I met Noah's gaze. His expression was soft but guarded, his presence as familiar as it was unnerving. He reached out instinctively, steadying the coffee cup in my hand before it tipped over. His fingers brushed mine briefly, a fleeting touch that sent an undeniable jolt through my system. I managed to thank him, though my voice was barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Noah looked well, better than well. There was a quiet confidence about him now that was undeniably attractive, a strength that seemed to come from within. He asked how I had been, mentioning my job at Millbrook Marketing, a detail that surprised me. Knowing he had asked about me made my pulse quicken. I shared a little about my work, explaining how it had been challenging but rewarding, while he listened with an encouraging nod. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy between us. There was so much I wanted to say, but my fear of saying the wrong thing kept me silent. Finally, Noah broke the tension, extending an invitation to join him for coffee. The offer was unexpected, stirring a mix of hope and hesitation within me. After a moment's pause, I agreed, and together we stepped back into the cafe, settling into a quiet corner. We sat for a while, the space between us filled with both the comfort of familiarity and the tension of everything left unsaid. Noah's question about how I had really been struck me deeply. He wanted to know more than the surface-level details, and I decided to meet his sincerity with honesty. I admitted that the past year had been hard, a whirlwind of loss and self-reflection. Losing him had been the wake-up call I hadn't known I needed, forcing me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. I spoke about the therapy sessions that had helped me uncover my patterns of selfishness, and about the changes I had worked hard to make. Noah listened intently, his gaze steady and kind. He acknowledged the progress I had made, expressing a quiet pride that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Hearing those words from him, knowing that he recognized the effort I had put into bettering myself, felt like a balm to wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. I took the opportunity to express my deepest apologies. Though I had said the words before, I needed him to know how deeply I regretted the way I had treated him. I spoke of the times I had taken him for granted, belittled him, and dismissed his feelings. He didn't interrupt, allowing me to fully share the weight of my remorse. When he finally responded, it wasn't with anger or bitterness, but with forgiveness. He explained how time, therapy, and self-reflection had brought him to a place where he could let go of the hurt and move forward. Hearing those words lifted a weight from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The hour that followed was filled with an easy conversation I hadn't expected. Noah shared stories about his promotion at work, his newfound passion for rock climbing, and the stray cat he had adopted. I spoke about my volunteer work at the animal shelter and my friendship with Emily, a connection that had become a source of genuine joy in my life. As our time together drew to a close, I felt a bittersweet ache. It had been so comforting to talk to Noah again, to see him smile and laugh, but I knew we could never go back to what we once were. Too much had happened, and some things, no matter how much we wanted them to, couldn't be undone. Before we parted, I asked if there was a chance for us to build a friendship. It was a hesitant request, one I made with no expectations. Noah considered it carefully before agreeing, his smile warm and genuine, the same smile that had once made my heart skip a beat. As I walked home that evening, a mix of emotions swirled within me. There was sadness for the love we had lost, joy for the possibility of a new beginning, and hope for the future. The journey of the past year replayed in my mind. I had lost so much, my marriage, my friendships, my sense of self, but in that loss, I had found something far more valuable. I had gained self-awareness, a renewed sense of purpose, and the strength to become a better person. Reaching the front door of my apartment, I paused for a moment, reflecting on how far I had come. This small space, paid for with my own hard-earned money, symbolized my independence and growth. I felt gratitude for the painful lessons that had shaped me, for the people who had stood by me when I didn't deserve it, and for the chance to start anew. That night, as I settled onto my couch, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would never again take the people in my life for granted. I would strive to be kinder, more patient, and more understanding. Most importantly, I would continue to love myself enough to never settle for being anything less than the best version of who I could be. As sleep enveloped me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead